Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with our latest gameplay and deck tech video to show you. In this series, we highlight a random deck on MTG Arena, and it can range from a spicy homebrew to a tier 1 meta deck that is hot on ranked. And if you do enjoy these videos that we make, all I ask for you is to give a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, as I would greatly appreciate your support. Now, if you like the deck we're playing today, I'll leave a link in the details below so you can give it a spin for yourself on Arena. Keep in mind that these videos will be pure gameplay, no commentary style, so you can enjoy the game. But if you do want to hear my deck tech analysis and thoughts, I'll leave that at the end of the gameplay. So without further ado, let's take the deck that you see right now and get started. Okay. Hear me out for a second, Barryan. I'm well aware of this, but let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, this is a Boros artifacts deck. Yes, I'm well aware that many people have already discussed and played this on many other YouTube videos, but I haven't had a chance to try it out yet, and there's a couple reasons why I wanted to talk about this deck now. First, of course, is, let's be real, Micro Machines sounds way cooler than just Boros artifacts. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind the original name, but if you've been playing as Magic as long as I have, don't you also kind of miss the names that we used to give decks like Ponza and Tron and Lucky Charms, just to name a few of the more classic old school style of naming Magic decks? Just a thought. So we're going to be utilizing a lot of Thopters in this deck, from Ornithopters. We're going to use Barb Spike and Yotia Declares War. These help us create a bunch of cute little Thopters that most of the time don't really do much. Maybe that Barb Spike might get you a little bit of damage, but not enough to help us win a game. So this is where the secret tech comes in, Retrofitter Foundry. Obviously, our biggest thing is we just get out some of our super cheap Thopters and we convert them over to these big constructs. They can start doing a ton of damage as early as turn 2, hopefully closing out the game possibly even as fast as 3 or turn 4. But in order to get there, we need to make sure that we can still get as aggressive as possible. If we don't have our Thopters, we have a couple of other ways of getting to what we need. So our creatures in the deck are Toolcraft Exemplar, Esper Sentinel, and Hushbringer. The original build, really quick, did not actually have Hushbringer in the main deck. It actually was in the sideboard. The original card that was here was actually Ingenious Smith, but after my playing with it, Ingenious Smith, well, it helps you kind of get a card, but I think it's too slow. It really wasn't effective for how to make this deck aggressive, and we really want to use Hushbringer for one specific reason. As you see, it shuts off ETB triggers whenever we play it. So that's a major reason why you want this in deck. It shows off a ton of game plans out there and it totally screws with a lot of people's decks. So that's why I highly recommend you main deck this. Otherwise, Esper Sentinel just helps us draw some cards. Most of the time it's going to get probably destroyed early in the game, but even being able to replace itself by getting at least 1 or 2 cards out of the deal is pretty sweet. Being that it's an artifact creature human soldier, it also has a relevant set of creature types, even if you don't use it in this deck. And then of course, Toolcraft Exemplar. Not too many people remember this card, but this card is solid in the early game. With even us having just one artifact out, it turns itself into a 3/2, so that means it can do a lot of early damage very quickly if our opponent doesn't have a way to deal with it. As far as the support package to get to our victory with our Thopters or maybe some of our creatures, we're going to use Shadow Spear, 2 in the main deck. This legendary artifact equipment allows us to get +1/+1 and trample and lifelink on a creature. But the main reason also you want to use it is not just for the pump ability, but to deal with some of our opponent's creatures that have hexproof or indestructible, basically any permanents actually, just shuts it off, and then that means we can just force through extra damage sometimes, and otherwise it prevents our opponent's game plans also from being utilized. As far as how we can maximize our damage, you kind of notice that many of our creatures are 1 or 2 drops that don't really do much on their own, and that's where Michigo's Reign of Truth comes in. This saga allows us to give a target creature +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment we control, and at the 3rd point it'll flip over into Portrait of Michigo, which gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment we control. Over a couple of turns, this basically pumps up one of our creatures into a massive threat, and usually we can close out the game in just 2 turns, so keep that in mind. Finally, I wanted to discuss one more time Yote Declares War. This card does a lot of other sweet things. So besides creating that little 0/2 Thopter, we then can tap any amount of untapped artifacts we control, and it deals that much damage to target creature or planeswalker. So this is your spot removal on a possibly repeatable thing, and I'll show you why in a second. And then of course the final part is we can then turn one of our artifacts we control into a 4/4. And remember, the key phrase here is artifact. So it can even be something like your Darksteel Citadel, which comes down indestructible 4/4, hopefully getting enough damage to prevent our opponent from getting to their win. But as far as how we repeat this, or say like maybe we want to utilize some of our other stuff, this is now where Loris comes in. And I'll be honest with you guys, I'm really surprised this card is still legal in Historic. I feel like it's only a matter of time before they probably ban this, but we're going to take advantage of it while we still can. Basically, it allows us to cast one of our permanent spells with a mana value of 2 or less from our graveyard. So since we're utilizing it as a companion, all of our stuff, even though it is a little low on the curve, can be very powerful. We can help utilize Loris to our max by grinding out more value even in the mid to late game. But otherwise, this deck is great in best of 1, and it's a highly aggressive deck that I highly recommend you want to try to be as fast as possible with. Don't be afraid to be a little reckless because the deck wants to try to win by turn 4 ideally. Our mana base otherwise is going to be a little bit of a mix. I know we only have technically in the main deck 1 red card, but we want to guarantee that we can get it out. So we will use some of our dual lands. Inspiring Vantage, I only recommend 2 personally, based on my personal experience, but if you want to use a whole playset, that's perfectly fine. The Pathway lands, this is again where it's going to be a little interesting because once we get to a Brothers War next week, this actually might be better to just use the Pain lands instead of the Pathway. And the reason for that is just you want to guarantee you have the right mana color when you need to cast something. So it gets really awkward if you say flip it to the wrong side, and it just really depends on how the luck of the draw is, for lack of a better term. Sacred Foundries, of course, and of course Darksteel Citadels. And Inventor's Fair is actually not in the original plan. If you've seen many deck lists out there, I highly recommend at least 1 copy just to give yourself a little bit of life. So that way shocking yourself, or when you get that Pain land, it won't hurt as bad. And even that tiny little bit of incremental life can sometimes mean the difference between surviving 1 more turn or losing the game. So therefore, we only need then 3 Spire of Industry. I know it's not really a heavily multicolored deck, but Spire of Industry, again, just ensures that we can get the right colors out on time. And with that, again, I'm going to recommend one more time, play this in best of 1. That's not to say you couldn't play this in best of 3, but best of 1 is where this deck excels the most. But if you do want to try it out in best of 3, then your sideboard is going to have a couple Mana Tithes, use some Glass Caskets for spot removal. I personally recommend Authority of the Consuls and Rip Apart as some spice in the sideboard. Authority of the Consuls, just make sure that aggro decks don't run us over and beat us to the punch. And Rip Aparts, again, just help us do a little bit more extra spot removal, but can also be flexible as an artifact or enchantment hate against our opponents. A Pithing Needle, just to stop whatever particular card, usually a Planeswalker in the early game. Reckoner Bankbuster, of course, just to get us some card draw. Create some more artifacts for us. Those treasures can be helpful in a pinch. And finally, some Unlicensors as your graveyard hate. But otherwise, that is the deck for you guys. So in the Brothers War, there's one particular card where I think that might make a threat to this whole deck's game plan. And that card is Brotherhood's End. If you haven't seen this from the previews, this card basically allows us to either deal 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or destroys all artifacts with a mana value of 3 or less. So obviously, with a Loris deck, this card will screw us over badly if we are not careful. The only thing that will survive is your Darksteel Citadel, which isn't really going to help you get to victory on its own. So that's the reason why I wanted to discuss this deck now. Fair warning, this card is most likely going to see some sideboard action, so be careful if you're going to play this in best of 3. This is why I highly recommend keep this to best of 1 to minimize the damage you might take from getting hit by this wrath that screws over your whole game plan. Just a thought going forward with this. But otherwise, you tell me in the comments below, what do you think? Are you actually a fan of this deck? Have you had to deal with it? What were your solutions for trying to overrun and defeat this deck? The only way I've seen this deck kind of struggles is either 1, the mana base kind of screws you over because again, we're a very low curve deck. Again, if you look right here, it says we only have a 1.3 average and we're only running in the deck about 22 lands, which again, does sound like actually more than enough. But what I mean by that is the land base might screw you over because you might get flooded when you actually need some action. But otherwise, if you haven't already done so, jump on the train if you do have the cards. This is an amazing deck. It's very powerful, and it is, again, a deck that's wholly unique to the historic format because of the cards it uses. If you do play it, and if you do get wins with it, or even if you're a person that's curious about it, I hope the video that I put out today will at least kind of give you an idea of like what you expect if you do want to play this. And if you are a fan of aggro decks, if you are a fan of artifact decks, give this deck a try. And again, I assure you, you will not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone. And just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.